Pastors Hart and Dominic Steele, and thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. We're talking today the changing face of Christian ministry to Asians. The face of Australia is changing. More than half of Australia's migrants come from Asia, and it's a field that's ready for harvest. We're putting it all out on the table today. We have leaders in the field: Ying Yee from Chinese Christian Church in Sydney, Adam Chung from Cross and Crown Church in Melbourne, and Steve Oh from Sydney's Living Hope Community Church. There is a big launch of the Gospel Coalition Asian Network Australia this Friday night, and they're all involved in that and all involved in the board of that Asian network. We're on the Pastors Heart Live this afternoon on the Facebook page, and if you have a question for any of these gentlemen, you could ask that on our Facebook page and I'll put it to them. Adam, let's start with you and your Pastors Heart. First generation migrant churches, second generation migrant churches, what's the difference and what are the tensions between the two?
Oh, there's so many differences. It's hard to know where to start. I think maybe put it this way: we chose to plant a church 2 years ago. We're 2 years old as of last week. And one of the reasons why we chose to plant, there's good reasons to stay.
And you're a second generation
I am.
church. Yeah.
I am. We chose to plant because we think there's so many gospel opportunities among that second generation migrant group. In many ways, they don't have the anti-theistic or anti-Christian baggage that might come with growing up here. But they're still religiously non-Christian. So there's a harvest there to be reached. And at Ying's church, I think they've got both first and second generation, which we've chosen just to focus on that second generation English-speaking group.
Well, let's bring
and
Ying.
third generation
And
too.
third generation. Ying, did he do the right thing or the wrong thing?
He did. But I think also the big difference is also the big cultural differences, like in terms of authority, in terms of community. Mm-hmm. And so when I went back to my church, that was a big shock to me. And so the way they think about authority is very different. Second generation to first generation. Mm-hmm. The way they think about community is very, very different. And so they've become big points of tensions and conflict in Asian churches right across.
I mean, I remember when I planted a church, my first treasurer was a young man who'd grown up at your church.
Oh, right.
And he worked for Goldman Sachs. He was a smart guy. I asked him to be my treasurer. And I remember joking with him, "Oh, mate, you never would have been church treasurer at a Chinese Christian church." He said, "Oh, no, Dominic, my dad's not old enough for that."
Now, that's interesting also because, in the Asian church, you become an adult, I think, when you have kids. So youth ministry in Asian church is up to about 40 plus. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting.
And so, Steve, what's your journey on first, second?
Yes,
generation?
so just listening to Adam and Ying, I think I'm sort of a third, which is a mix of the two. So we planted church 14 years ago. Mm-hmm. Before that, I was serving in a first-gen Korean church doing the education department. So I was overseeing the children's ministry to youth ministry, but also particular focus on the junior high ministry. It was a huge ministry. I mean, there were just the kids from creche to year 12, over 1,000 kids. So it was a huge ministry in and of itself. Yeah. So I was doing that, and then with the conviction to plant, we planted 14 years ago, and while we're predominantly ethnically Korean, we've become very much mixed these days. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's where I'm at, and so it's a middle ground between, I guess, Adam and Ying. Ying stayed, Adam's planted. Mm.
Why are you doing this Gospel Coalition Australia Asian Network? What's the change that you see that needs to take place in Asian ministry in Australia?
I think, as you said, I think what you see is a growing Asian community in Australia, right? And I think, to be honest, I think that many times the way we approach ministry has failed to understand the cultural uniqueness of the Asian community. I give, for example, my own experience when I grew up in University of New South Wales, doing ministry there, then come back to my church. Having learnt all the good ministry principles at New South Wales Uni, take it back, then I'm hit with a brick wall of opposition, hostility, and I couldn't work out what I did wrong, and I realised there's a big cultural difference. Mm-hmm. And I see that same problem here that's being repeated again and again and again. And there are many people trying to do it right, but just get it wrong. Mm-hmm. And I think what we need to do is to really help people see that not only there's a great need for reaching Asians, but also they need to be much more nuanced and understanding the cultural divide between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are some of these cultural differences? I mean, if you were planning a predominantly Anglo church as opposed to a predominantly Asian church in Melbourne, what things would you do differently?
I think one of the things that comes through is the thickness of relationship and community. By way of example, I grew up in an independent Chinese church, much similar to Ying's sort of church, and we would spend all day together. We'd be in each other's lives, in each other's homes. Family life, church life and social life were all pretty much the same thing. And then I remember going from that and moving to an evangelical Anglican church, wonderful church, teaches the Bible so well. But I remember getting to the end of Sunday and everyone said goodbye, and we didn't talk until next Sunday. Now, I suspect that might not just be a cultural issue, but the collectivism within Asian churches means that there's a thickness to relationship. And word ministry can be pulpit-centred, but it's never restricted to the pulpit. There's so much more that happens over coffee, over lunch, over dinner. And the role of a pastor isn't just the pastor preacher, but actually it's the pastor chaplain who's there along with his people.
It's very interesting to pick up on that point you just made about the cultural difference. We had some people come to our church. I mean, we were right in the inner city of Sydney. We had some people come to our church from the country, and they joined our church, and they were very disappointed with the depth of relationship in our church compared to their country church. And I mean, as they described the country church fellowship, it was much like you described. You know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's something to be said about the old parish model of church where everything was close together and relationships were thick and deep. That hasn't worked itself out in migrant communities, even though it might not necessarily be geographically located. People are willing to travel a lot further to come to a church. Normally they say, 15-minute drive is as far as people are willing to travel. We've got people that travel halfway across Melbourne to come to church. And I think it's because the metric isn't the local geographical parish, it's actually the cultural network.
And are you trying to do that same thickness of relationship with the second generation people?
Yeah, so my take on what similar things that Ying said is that so many second generation people grow up with a Western mind but an Eastern heart. So they think like Westerners, they critique sermons like Westerners. If they go through university campus ministry, they believe me, they critique their Sunday sermons like Westerners, but their desire for relationship is still very deep, and they inherit more from their parents' generation than they care to admit.
What's your take on that, Steve? Is it
Exactly the same. Exactly the same in the Korean church, and that was my experience growing up as well. Sunday was devoted to church, and so I'd be there early morning and throughout the whole day with people, with adults, friends, and so we grew up together that way. And I sense that same sort of stickiness, that same sort of relational connection, even amongst the second generation.
And yet you were telling me just before we pressed go on this program that in your church a few years ago you had 100 kids graduating year 12 and 90 of them left at the end of year 12. And so we had stickiness all through growing up, and then something went disastrously wrong at year 12. So
the stickiness would also be part of the cultural setting, the things that they're used to, the meetings, how things are done. And then they're going into an English service as opposed to youth group, and the structures, the people, everything is totally different to them. And so I think that newness would have turned some of them off. I mean, that's not the only reason, obviously, but I think that's part of it.
Now, let's just think, I've heard some people say the era of first generation churches is over, and then others saying, no, we're expecting a new wave of migration from Asia with what's going on in China, what's going on in Hong Kong. Let's start with you, Steve. What's your take on that?
So I think that idea of the migrant stopping, that's been, even in the Korean society, even in the Korean scene, that's been stated for a while now, but it hasn't come to fruition. And so even now, where we haven't seen as much, still we get in the Korean community, you get workers who have left Korea because it's just difficult to make ends meet. They don't want to get into that terrible rat race that is there, and so they migrate to a foreign land, Australia, and they settle here. And that's an increasing number for young families, young married couples. And so I don't think it's something that's going to end anytime soon.
Are you getting a sense, Ying, of more Chinese, more Hong Kong people coming out? There's still the need for first generation churches
I think there's still a need for two reasons. One, the number of Chinese Christians in Australia is still very, very small. So there's still a truckload of first generation. And so we need to keep reaching them. So I often keep saying to our Mandarin and Cantonese pastors, you still have a long way to go. We have not even reach a critical mass in reaching them. So that will never die. It's unlike many other ethnic groups where the number of people present is small. With the Asian, it's still pretty big. And I think the second thing is that even after COVID's over, I suspect that many people in the Asian world will still want to flood back into Australia because it is a safe place, right? It's a free place. It's a lifestyle which is good for the young people grow up. And so I suspect that a lot of people want to come back. And even now when I talk to some of the Cantonese pastors, they are expecting what's going on in Hong Kong. They are expecting another wave to come back to Australia.
Right.
So I can see it's going to be here for a long time.
Is it true what I'm hearing of conversion amongst the first generation is reasonably easy, but discipleship is difficult? Is that right?
I think that would be true in most cases because many people coming in, they'll come to the Chinese churches because of their, or even Korean churches, because of the cultural affinity that they have, and they hear the gospel. But there is a danger, what they hear may be unconscious in their thinking, sort of something that helps their prosperity. You know, kids get good education. So I think it could be said that the conversion is about a mile wide, but probably 1 inch deep.
Yeah, so adding on that, I think more so than conversion, I think it's a case where people are willing to attend church and be someone at church, at present at church, because they have those social connections, they have the social support networks that are there within that migrant community, but actually deeply growing in intimacy with Christ, understanding the gospel, hearing that's maybe not so much.
What are the complexities of having a bicultural church where you've got dual leadership structures, a Chinese network or a Korean network and an English network? Steve?
Korean culture is quite hierarchical, and so it's just not possible to have two leaders. So that's just the reality. And so in a Korean church, if you're in a predominantly first generation Korean church, the English congregation will always be seen at some level as the children.
Yeah.
They'll always be seen that way.
And there's a point that 30-year-olds don't want to be seen as children anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it's a difficult thing. And the most obvious difficulty would be the language. First generation, their fluent heart language is Korean. Second generation, as they grow up here, it's English, and there's that language divide, communication divide, but also things of the second generation. They're treated a certain way within society, in their jobs. Most of them are successful. Most of them are doing well, and yet they come to church, and there's that struggle of trying to fit in as a child once more. Sometimes there is that disconnect. There is that difficulty.
Someone told me, Ying, that in your early days at CCC, you had that experience a bit. You were told, get back in your box.
Absolutely. So when I came back, you could say that even before I officially started, I was getting into verbal fistfights with my leadership. That's even before I started. And so you could say that when I went back to CCC, all the arguments came out. And
Just us. Tell us.
Just tell us. I remember the first time that day one I get there and, the word's going around that I'm unteachable. I can't work in a team. I'm rebellious. And I couldn't work out what I was doing wrong. And I think it's highlight what Steve says, that I was trying to do things in the way how I had been taught back at New South Wales Uni, but unconsciously I didn't realise I was being given a Western model. The principles were great, I still take the principles, but I didn't understand how to transfer them into a cultural context. So, I was in my first time, I was taken off the congregation. From 5 years as a contract, I was given 1 year probation. That's after 5 years. I was promised to I'll be ordained in 6 months. It took 10 years. Then I had endless conflicts and so on like that. Yeah, but and when I look back on it,
you were quite a troublemaker.
Yeah. When I look back, I can see half it was my own stupidity, I have to acknowledge that, right? And the other half was the fact I just didn't understand the culture.
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to de-wind myself and realise what's actually gospel, what's culture, and how do the two fit together and work with each other. And that itself took a lot of undoing.
Okay, you're a generation after him.
Yep.
What have you learned from
He's not made the mistakes I have.
what have you learned from his mistakes that you've done differently, or where have you gone different?
Being in the same, well, I planted a church. No,
I mean, you did make that decision to do.
I did.
You said I don't want to be the daughter, the children church. Yeah.
Here's the funny thing, though. I actually think there's an opportunity for church plants that are English speaking to maybe, this might sound crazy, Steve, but to plant actually a first generation speaking church, because what you've done, you sever the parent-child connection between the two congregations. So you can pastor them on parity a lot more equally. But I chose to plant similarly for a lot of problems that Ying had, and I actually had a lot of those problems in my own church as well.
Before you planted?
Before I planted, when I was younger, and I wasn't blessed to be in the same city as Ying, so
He chose to leave, I chose to stay.
it was an action replay down in Melbourne with me. But I think one of the differences is actually education as well. What often happens, it's a very common story for high schoolers who are second generation to graduate, go to university. They go to a great campus ministry that teaches them the Bible, and they think to themselves, no one's ever taught me this before. No one's ever taught me the atonement with such clarity. And then they go back to their home church, which actually is genuinely Christian, but they articulate doctrine in less clear ways. But then they seek to get that doctrinal clarity from their church in the same way that they would get on campus. And that just leads to all sorts of conflict, because when they're asking doctrinal and theological questions of their parents' generation, well, the parents see that as rebellion, disobedience, and that just leads to more conflict within churches. So I think there's some of the issues that are there as well.
While I've got you, let me throw up some of the problems. Homogenous unit principle, Steve. You're doing the wrong thing, somebody says to you. What do you say?
I think we're all enculturated. Everyone's enculturated. And this side of glory, of course, when Christ returns, every nation, every tongue, people of all colours will be gathered around the throne worshipping our Lord. That's the beauty of what we're looking forward to. But this side of glory, there's limits to what we can do, and there's limits to how we gel. And while we'd like to be all things to all people at all times, I think sometimes we do need to choose where we're best fit. And so Paul, the Apostle Paul, his pattern was often to go somewhere and then start off with those he knew, the Jews, and then that was the means by which he did. And so for us as well, I think it's one thing to say we must always just be a Korean or a Chinese or whatever church, but it's another thing to say, well, this is where we have a familiar base, and we want to start here, but we're not putting up borders to people to stop people from coming in.
That's right. It's a good missiological starting point, bad ecclesiological ending point. And if you start there, that's great. But if you end there, I think that's just terrible. Yeah.
How do you? I mean, when I look at our church, I think one of our, if you like, systemic sins is greed. We're in a wealthy part of Sydney, and there's a temptation. So I'm always trying to preach against greed, but I don't feel the need in this lefty inner city area to preach against racism. But I do see amongst some of my Asian friends the need to preach against racism. Can you tell us how you tackle that topic? Why don't we start with you put up your hand.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, flowing on the idea of homogeneous unit principle, HUP. I see the danger that a Chinese church or Asian church has become so Asian-centric, right? Now, I truly believe there is a place for Asian churches long-term, but the way to avoid that, and this is one thing we want to try and do, is constantly in partnership with those beyond the Asian churches, constantly be praying for ministries beyond the Asian churches. And so one thing we always try to do is go to those big conferences in Sydney like KEC, get involved AEVS.
The
networks, because that way they don't become Asian-centric. And to also make sure that we are praying through something like the Joshua Project, right, where you're praying for whole world, and make sure that that's something we do that makes sure that ensures us that we are not so Asian-centric. We're Asian-focused, but not centric, that sort of thing. That's what we seek to do.
Adam?
I think this will actually be more of an issue going forward. I've noticed that Asian Australians tend to import the culture from Asian Americans. And when I look at America, there is actually an anger and an angry edge to the Asian American culture there, particularly post-COVID. I'm sensing that a lot of Asian Australians are feeling more in the minority, and what they're ending up doing is actually hitting back with in one sense, a reverse racism of our own. So we have to preach against that regularly. That's why, as a church, our vision is to see every tribe worship Christ as King. And I think we want to keep emphasising that though this is our current reality, we're called to something far greater. So that's something I actually preach into reasonably regularly, because you just want to stay ahead of that.
How do you tackle it in the Korean church, Steve?
So in terms of our church, our foundational documents point out that while we have a certain start, that's not where we want to stay. So we may start off with Korean second generations as we did, but that's not where we want to end up. And that's how we've progressed with our ministry. So we are predominantly Asian, but there is a diverse cultural mix, ethnic mix within our church. And while the ethnicity, at least at an outward level, may seem similar, I think what is different is culturally we straddle broader cultural divides than maybe other churches, because you've got recent migrants, you've got second gen, you've got people who grew up here but born overseas. So there's a huge cultural difference there. So in terms of where we're at, like just looking at our church, we're predominantly Korean Australian, and so we don't want that to be the dominating culture. And so things like when we have church meals. Let's not cater Korean. The simple things such as that.
At your church?
Oh, I'd love to. I mean, it usually ends up what's the cheapest, right?
And Steve, Steve, who are your link missionaries? They're not in Korea, right?
Yeah. Well, we talked about this. The primary missionary that we support, he has a connection to Korea because he's Indian, but he actually trained in a Presbyterian seminary in Seoul.
Yeah.
And he's a pastor of a church in Kolkata. Right. And so we support them, we pray for them, we send short-term missions team there.
Making some intentional decisions to work against the HUP, almost. What about...
Can I just say something? I think Adam pointed out something. The other reason why we want to have something like the Gospel Coalition Australia-Asia is not only to recognise the need for reaching the Asians, but also to actually celebrate that we're actually Asians. Because growing up, say for myself, my own journey was a certain embarrassment about me being Asian. I actually wanted to be non-Asian, right? But my hair's white, so I've sort of achieved that way. But I want to be. But I want to actually say to people, it's actually okay being Asian. Sure, it's okay to be in an Asian church. Okay, make sure that the gospel is there and shaping and driving, but don't be embarrassed or shamed or even just deny the fact of who you are, and play to that strength. Don't idolise it, but play to that strength.
What about the raising up of people for ministry? As I've been involved in raising up people for ministry, I feel like I've had more pushback from Asian parents about their sons and daughters stepping forward for Christian ministry than percentage-wise I've got from the Anglo parents. Do you want to speak to that issue, Steve?
Definitely, that's there. I mean, I've encountered that as well. So these days, a lot of parents realise the desperate need within Asian churches, within Asian circles, for ministry workers, and so they see the need, but the brackets afterwards is, but not my child. Anyone but my child. And we've had to navigate this.
And you're preaching against that?
I'm talking, well, not necessarily preaching, because it may not be the relevant passage, but speaking with parents. If I see children who may be potentially headed toward this, I want to speak into the parents' lives. And there's no greater privilege than word-based gospel ministry. And
you've been banging this drum for a while.
I have, and that was one of the reasons. So I remember one of the reasons why you could say that the leadership at the time had real problems when they interviewed me for a second contract. Say, what do you want to do? I just want to challenge all the young people to give up their jobs and go to ministry. Which I discovered is not it's not the thing you say, but it is. When you preach against that sort of thing and challenge people to think about ministry, the message that came back to me was, you're teaching people how to be lazy and things like that. And you've got to speak against that. But I'm very thankful that the second generation growing up now are much more open to ministry. So I've had the great pleasure of not only ministering to them when they were youth, but now ministering to them as parents. And now it's great to see the more openness and willingness to allow their kids to do what they want, even if it goes to the ministry.
What changes do we want to see at theological colleges in Australia and other Western countries to better accommodate the Asian and potentially the ESL person?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I'm also involved in another organisation in Brisbane called Centre for Asian Christianity, right? And then one thing I've been saying to them is that when you look at theological education, a lot of the dialogue is actually in European dialogue and conversations about theological issues. If we actually want to equip them for sort of working amongst Asians, we need to have a dialogue between the West and the East, not between the West and the West, right? But the West and the East. Reading in terms of what's going on in theological thinking in Asian context, not what in the European context or North American context and that sort of thing. I think that's a big conversation that needs to be had, which I think is we're still a long way away from. If we're going to be equipping them to actually work in that sort of context.
Who else are you reading who's speaking on these? I'm just thinking, when I think about Asian Christian authors, I've got Sam Chan, I've got Julius Kim.
Sam Chan, he's a Christian author, Asian. Yeah, he's Asian, is he? Asian. He's got an Asian name.
Yeah.
But Chan, anyway.
I'm going to leave that right away. I'm struggling for who else do you go to? Yeah.
That's the problem. There aren't. So, when we think about, just before that, Cole Truman, there's a big names like Tim Keller, Don Carson, but something equivalent in the Asian community in terms of theological depth and rigour, it's hard to know.
We've got to be raising up more people like that.
That's right.
Yeah. Adam?
I can't really think of many people in this space. I do think it's helpful to read missiology. I think a lot of the insights that you get, even if you don't agree with them, understanding the HUP, reading Don McGavran, at least helps you understand the thinking behind things. You might not take it, but it becomes a conversation partner.
But can I say also on that, it's interesting that when you have come across Asian theologians, they're still having the sort of Western dialogue rather than dialoguing in an Eastern context. So they're Asian in terms of their name, but the framework and the conversation is still a very sort of driven by a European Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment.
So the one place I want to push back on that, with all respect to you, is that I have seen other Asian theologians overseas use their Asian culture as effectively a hermeneutical grid through which to read everything. And so what they end up saying is, justification by faith alone. Well, that's Luther in a Western context. We need to go for more organic relational understandings of the gospel. And I think what they've done there is drive a cultural wedge to effectively offload a lot of Reformation and evangelical
I think you're right.
doctrines.
And I think that's the sort of dialogue we're going to have, because I think you're right. There is a danger where, again, it's the sort of culture, the interface between culture and gospel, and there is the danger that the culture shapes our gospel and theological thinking, but we've got to work out how we can have the gospel to speak into that culture and have that dialogue. But I totally agree with you.
I was interested before, a couple of minutes ago, Adam, you spoke about the difference between some of the thinking of the Asian American and then its impact on the Asian Australian. What are some of the other cultural differences you see between the Asian American, the Asian Australian, the Asian New Zealander, the Asian UK person, and how those cultural impacts are happening between the various countries? Maybe start with you, Steve. Yeah.
Well, I think with the Asian Americans, because I'm more familiar with them, the difference between the Asian Australians within a church context and Asian Americans within the church context, the Asian Americans tend to be a lot more vocal and outspoken. They'll voice their position, their hurts a lot more readily than necessarily the Asian Australians. A lot of the Asian Australians I know tend to suck it up, tend to just go along with it. And so there is that difference. But it's interesting that, Adam, you said that there is a shift in that. There is a bit of a shift in that these days.
Ying?
Just saying, because I've been reading that sort of literature for the last 30 years trying to work this sort of out. I agree with what Steve said, and I also agree with Adam. There's a certain anger and bitterness that comes out of Asian Americans. And I think the sad thing I find that is they reduce everything purely to a cultural problem. Everything down to cultural. And so when I was reading literature, it's just all culture and culture, but there's no dialogue with what the gospel is about and this sort of thing. And that's the thing I find despairing. So they'll tell you all the problems. They'll tell you that we just need to learn to communicate with each other. But there's no degree of understanding about grace and repentance and sin in that dialogue. Now, I'm not saying it's all just that, but I'm saying it's not just all culture as well. And that's why the big thing is this sort of culture gospel dialogue. Yeah.
Last word, Adam?
It's a bit sharp, but I think retribution is easier than reconciliation. And I genuinely think there is a sense of, if you've been a grieved minority for any number of years, there is a sense in which you want to prove yourself, and that anger and that edge can easily come through. But the gospel tells a very different story about grace and reconciliation, and I think that's what we need to bring to it.
Gentlemen, thanks very much for this conversation this afternoon.
Cool.
My guests on The Pastor's Heart are Steve Oh from Sydney Living Hope Community Church, Ying Yee from Chinese Christian Church in Sydney, and Adam Chung from Cross and Crown in Melbourne. And of course the launch of the Gospel Coalition Australia Asia Network this Friday night. You go to thegospelcoalition.org.au/Asia for details on that. Thanks for joining us on The Pastor's Heart, and we will see you next Tuesday afternoon.